And it's only been in the last 20 years that there have been considerable contributions to the field. Fred Coolidge and I have been working together since I think the year 2000. My memory serves me correctly. Fred is a psychologist. I am an archaeologist. We have been probably best known for proposing and defending the enhanced working memory hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that argues that a modest increase in working memory capacity occurred somewhere in the last 100,000 years and powered the final evolution of modern thinking. Our text, The Rise of Homo sapiens, The Evolution of Modern Thinking, is now in its second edition and is much cited. Our talk today has two parts. In the first, I will provide a brief account of the epistemology of underpinning cognitive archaeology and hope I do not bore you too much. And the second half, Fred will talk about the evolution of working memory. So what is cognitive archaeology? Basically, cognitive archaeology uses archaeological remains to document cognitive abilities of people who lived in the past. There are actually two brands, or two varieties of cognitive archaeology. The first is what Fred and I call ideational cognitive archaeology, and this studies archaeological remains to recover the symbolic systems of people who lived in the recent past. So people who do this work in time period of the last 10,000 years. The second group are evolutionary cognitive archaeologists, and we study the evolution of human cognition from the appearance of stone tools 3.3 million years ago to the present. You should probably also be clear about what cognitive archaeology is not. We are not evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is a well-established specialty in the field of psychology, and it uses different methods and different theories. Evolutionary psychology relies primarily on experimental psychology as a methodology. Evolutionary cognitive archaeology relies on the analysis of archaeological remains. We're also different theoretically. Evolutionary psychology is narrowly Darwinian in its approach to evolution and emphasizes how cognitive abilities adapt an organism to the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, which is a hypothetical time in the past when people lived by hunting and gathering. Evolutionary cognitive archaeology, on the other hand, relies on theories drawn directly from cognitive science and focuses more on large-scale evolutionary changes and documenting macroevolutionary patterns. You're also not paleoneurology. Paleoneurology is a field that studies fossils, in particular the brain endocasts of fossils and other ways of measuring the internal shape and size of brains. Evolutionary cognitive archaeology, on the other hand, studies artifacts. We do not primarily study fossils. However, there's a good deal of overlap between the two fields. I'd like to start with a few examples of what one might call common sense cognitive archaeology. Ancient artifacts have always inspired speculation about the people who made them. Quite naturally, some of this speculation concerns the minds of those people. So if you look at the image on the left, this is a fairly famous artifact in archaeology. It's known as the Hodenstein-Stadel figurine. It's an ivory statue carved out of an elephant tusk. It's now about 12 inches tall, and it's about 40,000 years old. And as you can see, it's the image of an imaginary creature with a lion's head and a human body. And when you see something like this, it's quite naturally to ask the question, what was the person thinking who made this? And in this case, it's a very familiar kind of artifact. Modern people make these kinds of things all of the time. Slightly different example is on the right. This is from Auditorium Cave in Ardipithecus. After a couple of decades, we finally settled on an age for this phenomenon. It's something over than 290,000 years old. And some hominin, probably Homo heidelbergensis, maybe early Homo sapiens, modified the bedrock by producing these cupules, these concavities in the stone, and then producing these sort of sinuous lines running between them. What does it mean? I mean, how can we interpret this? And this has inspired a lot of speculation. Third example is, in some ways, even more interesting. It's from the South African site of Makapanskap. It's a jasperite pebble that was found in an archaeological deposit that dates to about 2.5 million years ago. It's what we call an exotic, which means it's made out of raw material that someone carried in. It's not a local stone. Technically, it's not an artifact because it hasn't been modified. It's a natural pebble. And yet, most people who look at this immediately see a face. So what this suggests is someone 2.5 million years ago, in this case it was probably an Australopithecus, picked this object up and carried it home. Why? What does that mean? And there's been a lot of, I think, groundless speculation that it suggests some kind of symbolic behavior. It turns out that's not necessarily the case. On the right, the final example is a hand axe, that's the term we use for it, from the South African site of Katupan. There are, by the way, many hand axe sites in India, and it is actually one of the best places in the world for studying these kinds of artifacts. This particular hand axe is a beautiful artifact. I think if you look at it, you can see that the maker spent a lot of effort trying to bring out the colored layering in the stone. Artifact is also probably 500,000 years old. What does this tell us? Is this the beginnings of art? Is the beginnings of aesthetic sense? The problem we have is that if you just approach artifacts from a common sense perspective, you can't make a very persuasive argument. So cognitive archaeology takes this natural curiosity about prehistoric minds and formalizes it into scientific investigation. Now, you might well ask, and I imagine some of you are, how is it possible to access the thoughts of people and other hominins who lived hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago? So I'd like to dwell on this slide for a little bit and take a brief look at the nature of reasoning used by cognitive archaeologists. All archaeological reasoning is based on the interpretation of artifacts, using a series of inferences. The artifacts do not speak for themselves. Cognitive archaeology differs from other kinds of archaeology only in the theories it uses to ground these inferences. Now, I borrowed this particular chart from a linguist named Rudy Bota, who uses this as a way to represent arguments for the evolution of language. But in this case, I'm going to look at something different. I'm going to use it as an example, an argument made by the archaeologist Lynn Wadley, as a South African archaeologist. And this is an interpretation of a particular kind of stone tool, which you see in the bottom row on the left. And what I'm going to do is run through this sequence of inferences. There are basically three successive inferences in this argument. The first inference is what we would call the ABC inference, which is arguing from an artifact or feature to a technical system. So if you look at the bottom, the argument takes us from this isolated stone tool to a stone-tipped arrow. So you might well ask the question, why do we think that this particular artifact was part of a stone-tipped arrow? Two reasons. That is, there are two kinds of reasons we use in this case. One is known as ethnographic analogy. Native peoples in South Africa, historically and prehistorically, in the recent past, made arrows like this. And we've actually found examples in historic cave sites. So that's one reason for thinking this artifact was a component to an arrow system. The second reason is a purely archaeological one, and is based on what we term residue analysis. There are very tiny remains of the actual adhesive used that still adhere to the stone tool. And we can remove those adhesives, analyze them chemically, and determine what the nature of the adhesive was. So this first inference, the ABC inference, is not very controversial. Archaeologists don't really question that it is an accurate one. The second inference, what we call the CDE inference, argues this technical system to the procedures and knowledge necessary to make it. So What underpins this argument? What makes this a reasonable inference? Well, in this case, Lynn Wadley did what we call actualistic research. She and her colleagues reproduced the technology using local materials and ran through a number of different scenarios to try to produce or reproduce this kind of technology. And after scores of attempts, finally came up with a system that reproduced the technology precisely. And based on that reconstruction, she identified the procedures and knowledge necessary to do it. The third inference, which we might call the cognitive inference, the EFG inference, starts with procedures and knowledge and asks the question, what are the cognitive prerequisites to do that? And in order to make that argument, one needs a theory of cognition. And one of the ones that Lynn Wadley used was the one that Fred Coolidge and I have advocated, which is the enhanced working memory hypothesis. And based on her application of this theory, she then argued that production of this technology required abstract reasoning. So I apologize for that long example, but I did want to emphasize that cognitive archaeology relies on a series of inferences. It's not just a flash of insight. We have to reason very carefully from the archaeological remains to the conclusion. Bota likes to argue that an inference has to be both grounded and warranted. And grounding means that to be persuasive, the inference about cognition must be grounded in an established theory of cognition. And in evolutionary cognitive archaeology, today there are a number of different theories that people use to ground their arguments. The most common, and the one Fred and I use, is cognitive neuroscience. But there are other theories that have been used. Recently, there's been a move to switch to theories of 4E cognition, that is embodied cognition embedded in active and extended cognition. Probably the leading proponent of this is Lambros Malafores at Oxford University, and Fred and I have done some work with Lambros. There's still some people who use Gibsonian ecological psychology. This is a minority position, but there are a number of people who do it. There's some advantages to it. There are also cognitive archaeologists who use Peircean semiotics. Technically, this is not a cognitive theory, but it does drive a lot of the interpretations of prehistoric symbols and prehistoric sign systems. Finally, there are developmental psychological theories. My initial work 45 years ago was applying Piagetian theory to stone tools, but Vygotsky has also been used. So in addition to grounding an argument in theory, it's also necessary to apply that theory to archaeological remains, and that's really a methodological piece. And methods select from the varieties of possible evidence and provide frameworks for marshaling the evidence. And evolutionary cognitive archaeology relies on several. I'm just going to talk about four. One is what I term description or redescription. Second is actualistic studies. Third is chain operatoire or operational chains. And the final one is neuroarchaeology. I'm going to talk about each in turn. So one method, and the one that Fred and I probably use the most, we would call description or redescription. And in this particular method, one first identifies a set of attributes derived from cognitive science, and then uses those attributes to analyze prehistoric artifacts. So the example I want to give is from an English site, at the site of Box Grove, which is again about 500,000 years old. The interesting thing about Box Grove is all of these hand axes, and you can see them in the picture on the right, were manufactured by a single group of people over a period of about 80 years. A pretty remarkable site from that perspective. So, the question I had concerned the spatial cognition of the people living at the site. So, what I did was define a set of attributes derived from literature on spatial cognition, and I'll just focus on a few. As you can see from the artifact on the left, these hand axes are bilaterally symmetrical. The symmetry is something we talk about in cognitive and spatial cognition. But what's more remarkable about this artifact is that it's not just bilaterally symmetrical, it's symmetrical from all angles. That is, if you look at it in profile, it's symmetrical. If you were to take a saw and cut it through at any angle, the cross-section would be symmetrical. So what we have is an artifact that presents three-dimensional symmetry. Whoever made this artifact could think about the tool in 3 dimensions as he or she made the tool. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the person who made this artifact, and indeed everyone at the site, had an ability in what we term allocentric perception, the ability to reconstruct alternative viewpoints, not the same viewpoint as ego. And this is an important part of modern human spatial cognition. So what this tells us is that by 500,000 years ago, our spatial cognition was essentially modern. And that's an interesting conclusion if we're interested in human evolution. The second example we've talked about already in the context of Lynn Wadley's study. These are actualistic studies and experimental archaeology. This approach uses modern humans as proxies for prehistoric humans. We try to reconstruct the technology and how the technology was used. As you might imagine, undergraduates love this approach because they get to go outside and get dirty and play around with things. But what we're trying to do is recover the cognition used to do these things. So that means we also have to do it in a controlled fashion and occasionally use experimental protocols borrowed directly from cognitive psychology. Excuse me. The third method is known as the chaîne opératoire method. As you might guess, it's borrowed from the French. And this method sets out to describe an entire sequence of action involved in the production and use of a prehistoric artifact. Often this starts with experimental archaeology, but the idea is to try to put it in a comprehensive presentation so that we can see the sequence of actions employed and identify the kinds of decisions that the original prehistoric maker used in the past. This is a particular complex example. It's from Miriam Heidel and Marlies Lombard, and it's again from this South African Middle Stone Age, and is the chaîne opératoire reconstructed for the production of a bow and arrow system. Finally, a more recent approach that is producing some very interesting results is what we call neuroarchaeology. And again, this uses proxies to reproduce human artifacts or prehistoric artifacts, and then uses neuroimaging to try to identify the activation patterns that are required. Now, you might imagine there are some methodological issues. First methodological issue, of course, is that modern college students are not Homo erectus. So can we use them as appropriate proxies for Homo erectus? Some people say yes, some people say no. The other has to do with the technology itself. Most of what we're interested in an evolutionary point of view, requires people to move about. So there are very few neuroimaging technologies that allow you to move when they're used. One is functional near-infrared spectroscopy. So the woman on the left is napping a stone tool, and she's wired up to one of these imaging systems. Now it turns out that that system is very coarse. We can't see much more than laterality using it, so we have limited results from that. On the right, what you see are results from research by Dietrich Staub at Emory University. And he investigates neural activation patterns in stone napping. Now, how do you do that if you can't actually stone nap while you're in an fMRI scanner? He uses various kinds of visualization techniques, and I think many of you know how these work. And he especially uses comparative method in which he'll scan individuals as they visualize making a hand axe as opposed to visualize making a simpler stone tool, and contrast the activation patterns with them. Fred and I like to apply what we call a strict standard in cognitive archaeology. This means that arguments have to have cognitive validity and archaeological credibility. And cognitive validity simply means the cognitive ability in question must be recognized or defined by cognitive science. Second, it must be required for the activities we're looking at. There's a caveat here. It means we can only reconstruct the minimum necessary competence for producing and using a particular kind of technology. In other words, there's a real likelihood that we underinterpret some examples from the prehistoric times. And finally, the archaeological traces must result from those activities. This is a measure of strict parsimony. Archaeological credibility really means that the findings have to meet an archaeological standard in terms of coming from a well-excavated site in good context that's been well dated. And we could go into a lot of detail about that, but this is not a talk on archaeological methods. Finally, evolutionary cognitive archaeology produces two kinds of outcomes. That is, two results. One, we can trace the evolution of a particular cognitive ability over the course of human evolution. For example, Professor Coolidge and I have talked about the evolution of working memory capacity. I've talked about the evolution of spatial cognition, the evolution of aesthetic cognition. Second, we can use it to compare the cognition of one kind of hominin to another kind of hominin. For example, we can compare Neanderthal cognition with modern human cognition. And Fred and I have gotten into trouble doing this, and maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Fred, assuming we can get the technology to work. And Fred will talk about the evolution of working memory. So Fred, I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. Our ancestral history primarily across brains and size, we're going to know that brains have changed. First, we have this at the start, this definition of hominids versus hominins. So hominids is the broader category. So it's all current and extinct great apes, which includes us, our ancestors, direct ancestors, and gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. And hominins is the more narrow term. So that's modern humans, all our extinct relatives, since probably the common ancestor of chimpanzees and modern humans split about 6 million years ago, roughly, although it's a bit controversial. So that's what a hominin is. Okay, so of course the fossil record is really going to be sparse because these fossils, if they're 6 or 7 million years old, don't fossilize very well. So these, so there's the skull of one of the earliest that we think may be our distant ancestor, Sahelanthropus chadensis, and about 6 million years ago. A very, very ape-like way of life. It starts to get interesting about 4.4 million years ago. This was made all the headlines, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. Ardipithecus ramidus, they called him Ardi. And a brain size, though, 200 cc's, which is half the size of modern chimps. So undoubtedly still a very ape-like way of life. And of course, about 40 or 50 years ago, we had Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And Australo means southern, and Pithecus means ape. And Afar is the Afar Triangle in Eastern Africa, where this skeleton was first found. They were playing a Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, at the time, so they decided to call her Lucy. And a brain size just about the size of modern chimps, 478 cc's, and this is about 3.1 million years ago. Only 3.5 feet tall, 60 pounds, and so Lucy had to live in trees. But brains are a very metabolically expensive tissue. Now remember, over 1 million years since Ardi to Lucy, we over doubled brain size. And you can't double in brain size without meat eating, because although our brains only take up 2% of our body, it sucks up about 25% of our calories. need 25% of our calories to run our brains. So very expensive metabolic tissue. So although Lucy lived in trees, in nests, slept in nests in trees, she had to supplement her diet with meat and probably scavenged it on the ground. She could have hunted a little bit. There's these modern primates called bush babies, and chimpanzees sometimes hunt them live to supplement their diets. Then the biggest change, probably one of the greatest change in the archaeological record or fossil record, is Homo erectus. In Homo erectus, you can see brains went up and doubled nearly to 950 cc brain. They were 6 feet tall or more, probably weighed 120 pounds or more. They had to live full time on the ground. Now, Lucy lived in a nest for protection and in trees, but too many nests would attract predators. So there had to be a limit on the nests. But Homo erectus, living way too big and heavy to live in a nest in a tree, lived on the ground and probably in groups of 100. So we had this vast expansion of group size. And it took, in a way, a reciprocal nature between the size of the group and the size of the brain to know who's cheating in a group and to know who's pulling their weight. You had to have, not only facial recognition, but social recognition of who really helps and who really hurts a tribe. So we get this social brain hypothesis is that brains grew also because they needed to keep track of members of larger groups. Another big jump is heidelbergensis. And Homo heidelbergensis appeared about 800,000 years ago. Notice brain size jumps to 1250 cc's with a modern brain about 1350. But not modern shape. So we have a longer, flatter brain, relatively compared to our much rounder modern human brains. And some of Homo heidelbergensis at this time, 800,000 years ago, probably way earlier, left Africa and went to Europe and Asia. The heidelbergensis is going to give rise to the last slide that Professor Wynn showed, Homo sapiens and Neandertals. So we know genetically they diverged about 600,000 years ago. So Neandertals in Europe and Asia are likely descendants of Homo heidelbergensis who first left Africa. And they were continually leaving Africa over a couple million years. We find a bunch of Homo heidelbergensis, for example, in Spain at about 1.4 million years ago. Then we have a critical time in modern culture as Homo sapien descendants of the African Homo heidelbergensis enters Europe within about 45,000 years ago. Within 10,000 years of Homo sapiens entry into Europe, Neanderthals went extinct. We do know that there was some limited interbreeding. Now, we do know that Neanderthals are extinct, but modern humans carry from 0% to 4% of Neanderthal DNA. So this notion that Neanderthals live within us, still, yes, some of their DNA we carry. And that was that limited interbreeding 80,000 to 40,000 years ago. And these are some of the Neanderthal depictions. They were rather negative, as you can see, that upper left guy. And then a rather more handsome picture of the upper right guy. Here's a group of Neanderthals on the left, on the bottom. And you can see that one of the interesting aspects of this picture is there's this third hand hypothesis that Neanderthal teeth invariably are striated. That is, they were using their mouths and teeth as like a third hand. And Homo sapiens teeth at the same time is not so striated. So the question is, why were Neanderthals using their teeth so much? And that's the third hand hypothesis. And this paleoneurologist, Emiliano Brunner, says it must have been some deficit in their visuospatial abilities, but it's rather controversial. In America, we had this very popular commercial where they took a Neanderthal, that's the lower guy on the right, and they took an actor, made him look like a Neanderthal, and made him intelligent, funny, humorous, sad, all kinds of modern emotions attributed to Neanderthals, in a way saying Neanderthals were just like us, they simply went extinct. And this is a contrast, probably too dramatic, of the modern brain size is, that's Homo sapiens on the left with the modern 1350 cc's. You can see that rounder brain, and you can see the bigger, actually maybe 10% bigger brain of Neanderthals on the right. Here's, you can see the height, modern humans, much like Homo erectus, up to 6 feet tall or taller. Neanderthals averaging about 5'3" to 5'6", and because of their robust bodies and robust skeletons, means thick and stocky, it probably estimates are 35% more calories just to walk. Remember, with a 10% bigger brain, it's going to require more calories also just to run their brain, and they needed these calories from meat. The Homo sapiens body has been called gracile, and that means we didn't have, because we were thinner, we didn't have the same meat requirement. We liked meat, needed meat to fuel our bodies, but we had lesser reliance on meat. So here's where working memory comes in, and our enhanced working memory hypothesis. This is well known. There was this huge volcanic explosion in Indonesia around 77,000 years ago, and they called it the Toba explosion. And now there's Toba Lake, as I understand it, in Indonesia. And the world, because of all that ash, the world was plunged into a volcanic winter, about 6 years in length, and a sudden ice age that lasted about 1,800 years. Genetic studies support the idea that all present humans, there's not one person on Earth now who isn't related to about 2,000 reproducing Homo sapiens in Africa. So yes, there were people, human types, let's say, Neanderthals, all over the world at that time. Well, not all over the world, but mostly over Europe and Asia. And everybody's related to the 2,000 that came out of Africa. And those descendants of Homo sapiens came out of African Homo heidelbergensis and entered into Europe. And as I said before, within 10,000 years, Neanderthals went extinct. And we think that those Homo sapiens 40 to 45,000 years ago, that we're all related to, carried fully modern minds, which we call enhanced working memory. So why did Neanderthals go extinct? Well, we think that there was we are nothing, humans are nothing but a series of mutations. Some beneficent, some good, mostly neutral, have no effect, and some, horrible genetic events take people right out of the gene pool. You die early or you die in the womb. And so we think that relatively around the time of the Toba explosion, around 100,000 years ago to maybe even 50,000 years ago, imagine if a child was born right now, a magnificent child, unbelievably gifted and thinking. How long would it take that child's genes to go through 7 billion people? A very long time. But imagine if there were only 2,000 humans and a group has this beneficent gene, it could pass through that bottleneck and spread out to the present population much faster. And so we propose that this genetic mutation enhanced our basic thinking, which is called working memory. And then what it allowed was Homo sapiens could then move into any environment and extract more resources than Neanderthals. I just imagine if Neanderthals had a song, and it's controversial whether they could sing or not, or play instruments or not, that it would be meat, 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 meat. They needed meat. They needed that meat to fuel their brains and their bodies. And we were, because of our gracile bodies, we were less dependent. So because of this genetic mutation in working memory, we could solve new problems. It's called fluid intelligence. We could solve new problems better than Neanderthals. All over mostly Europe. The two things on the one on the left and that little plaque on the bottom, they were counting something, and actually that bottom one, they think they were counting moon phases, the phases of the moon over a month. The barbed ivory in the center for hunting, and of course that amazing Hohenstein-Stadel figurine on the right that's so provocative. And we have nothing like that with Neanderthals. And then, of course, we have elaborate cave paintings. We have nothing qualitatively, anything like this is Chauvet about 34,000 years ago. Some of the amazing things about those bulls in the cave is the artist painted sometimes where with the rock came out, that's where they painted the chest of the bull. And where they behind the shoulder, they would use an indentation in the rock. So they carefully not only chose their, the idea or the image, but they chose where they'd place that image. Now, also imagine too, on the right, you see all these horses' heads. And of course, the caves back then were lit all over like modern caves with modern lighting. So imagine taking a torch and you're walking, someone's painted that picture and you're walking along with your torch, it might look like a moving picture. And the bottom picture on the bottom picture in the middle, the same thing. Imagine if you're walking with that torch, you might even get a picture of motion, like early motion picture. These are modern minds, and this is, since it's about 34,000 years ago, what it means is Neanderthals were absolutely going extinct in that time. Within 4,000 years of this, all Neanderthals are gone. There's a cave in France, Rouffignac, and that's the upper right, where there's about 300 images and 200 of them were woolly mammoths. So obviously the artist was quite taken by the woolly mammoths. And by the way, those images only appear 1 kilometer, like 0.6 of a mile into the cave before you start seeing the images. So they were a rather private museum. So here's Baddeley's working memory model, and this is why my work with Tom has been so productive, is it gives us an absolutely solid cognitive model. And that's, Baddeley's been working on this since 1974. And it parallels everything we know in even more older neuropsychological work. And that is this central executive, that's this decision-making part. And we do know that the prefrontal cortex in modern minds does make decisions and pays attention and selects what to do. And it does so basis, let's jump down to the phonological store. This is what you hear and can record. And this is one way of learning something. So like if you did ek, do, teen, ek, do, teen, ek, do, teen, and you learn, oh, that means 1, 2, 3, it would be stored in declarative long-term memory. So notice phonological store temporarily stores things, but if you rehearse it over and over, it automatically goes into declarative long-term memory. On the right side is this visual spatial sketchpad, and that's what you see. And notice what you could do too is if I said, imagine a blue elephant, you can have that image in your head, the blue elephant, but you have the name, the tag, phonological store. Now, where did that integration occur? According to Baddeley, go up 1 level, and that's in the episodic buffer. So what it does is it takes these images and takes the sound, tags them, and then you can save that. You can even save that image, and that image actually would be saved in the episodic buffer. It's temporary, according to Baddeley, and that would be saved probably in that procedural long-term memory, which we also call implicit memory. Probably we could put down episodic memory when we recall things long-term of episodes of our life, like little snips of movies. That's probably more on that right side of that of this pyramid. And so what we believe is, did Neanderthals have working memory? Did they make decisions? Did they have a central executive? Of course. Could they see things and store those images? Of course. Did they have sounds for things? Without a doubt. If modern vervet monkeys have different names for different predators that they teach their young that elicit different responses, Neanderthals had names for things. And those names could be stored if rehearsed, and the group of Neanderthals, repeats it to one another, you have declarative long-term memory. So they had, we don't deny Neanderthals had working memory, but we think the genetic mutation, and by the way, there's absolute genetic evidence that something major happened within 100,000 to 12,000 years ago. And the geneticists tell us, well, the center of that event, the estimation, is about 35,000 years ago. We believe actually that it was earlier, but nonetheless, we get an enhancement. Now, the nature of the enhancement, what did this genetic event do? It's possible that it simply increased phonological storage. So, for example, my sweet brother, who did not go to college, I notice his phonological storage is not as great as mine. So if you were to say to him, and he doesn't know Hindi, and you say, ek, do, teen, char, panch, he would probably go, ek, do, ek. His phonological storage is shorter. So one possibility is if you have enhanced phonological storage, it allows you to hear more things, to work on more complex comprehension. So your comprehension can handle longer utterances. Longer utterances gives you more information. It's possible also, though, that it affected the visuospatial sketchpad. So the nature of this enhancement, we're not quite certain. It could have affected the episodic buffer. We do not know. But it does seem that Neanderthals were thinking almost like modern humans, except we see that paucity in the archaeological record. And that's why Tom Wynn and I have decided that this is that enhanced working memory, because of a genetic mutation, gave modern humans an advantage that allowed them to navigate the environment and extract more resources without having to go to war with Neanderthals. And that's why the thing that we've have not paid attention to are the brain differences between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And you remember I said earlier, modern shape, like heidelbergensis, did not have the modern shape. Neither did Neanderthals. And so there's a number of paleoneurologists tell us it's a number of brain differences. Interestingly, some of them include, probably the most important is the parietal lobes. We had expanded parietal lobes. Notice that's the home of visuospatial sketchpad, but it's also the home of this curious theory called theory of mind, to able successfully to anticipate and think what other people are thinking and feeling. That's actually in a visuospatial sketchpad, but also that enhanced ability to recognize where you are in the environment is visuospatial. So we had expanded parietal lobes. Interestingly, we had larger cerebellum, which we know speaks thoughts like it does motor movements. And we had larger olfactory bulbs, giving us theoretically better smell discrimination, olfactory discrimination, and smaller occipital lobes, which actually means reliance on direct visual recording was probably less. But again, sort of the internal images that we make in the visuospatial sketchpad were expanded. And that's where we think maybe that this enhanced working memory affected these modern humans who swept into Europe and 45,000 years ago with fully modern culture, and Neanderthals went extinct. And that's all I have to say about that, except for our books. And so there's that second edition. Tom and I wrote recently, published last year, I think, The Evolution of Modern Thinking. On the left, a book we wrote in 2012, which is actually a bit of a trade book, but a bit of a textbook, How to Think Like a Neanderthal. And then a book that I just wrote on the evolution of structures and functions of the human brain in the center. And so you're certainly welcome to email us with any questions. And I noticed that we have some questions now in the chat. Is that true, Vaishnavi?
Yes. Yes, we have some questions. We will take them in a while.
Okay. And should I stop sharing now?
Yes.
Okay.
So I would like to thank Professor Wynn and Professor Coolidge for indulging in this wonderful presentation. And now I invite Professor Ramesh Mishra, who is the Chair, Center for Neural and Cognitive Sciences, and he will have a brief discussion with our speakers.
I thank Professor Wynn and Professor Coolidge for their really fantastic talk. And why we also be interested, because this is a fascinating area. And my own interest in cognitive archaeology is pretty recent, and I must say that it's primarily because of one article that I encountered 2-3 years ago by Professor Wynn, and then I started following it up. And he was kind enough to review one of my chapters, which I wrote in one of my earlier books in the context of evolution of bilingualism. And they had sent that book as well. So that's the brief background to my own interest in cognitive archaeology. But nevertheless, focusing on this particular talk that both of you have given very excellently, some questions, very general, arise. This discipline certainly is sitting at the interface of certain other disciplines, most particularly cognitive psychology, if I have understood it well. And there have been many other developments in working memory models, in selective attention, so on and so forth. And you have implicated Bradley's model, which is one of the most well-known models. Do you struggle to keep track with developments in cognitive psychology so that you can put those models to test with regard to prehistory and what was going on when people are doing this kind of stuff? Because anyone of you like to answer?
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's actually one of the challenges of cognitive archaeology, is keeping track of 2 or 3 disciplines simultaneously, and it's a challenge. Let me just say that. And we would like to say we keep abreast of all of the developments in, for example, working memory research, but practically speaking, we sometimes get them secondhand. So primarily we, at least in my case, I attend to the literature in archaeology and paleoanthropology, and secondarily, the cognitive psychology literature. Though to be perfectly honest, I enjoy reading the cognitive psychology literature a lot more than I enjoy reading the archaeology literature, probably because I've read so much archaeology in my career that it tends to be a little tedious. So to answer your question, yes, we try to keep abreast of developments, but are we at the very cutting edge? Maybe not.
All right.
Fred, do you have anything to add?
Professor Coolidge, I gathered that you have traveled to India quite often and probably on Fulbright scholarships to Gandhinagar, IIT Gandhinagar. And we have an extraordinary Indian archaeological site in the state of Gujarat. So anything you had to do with any Indian archaeological sites in any investigations?
No, but I've been primarily like a theorist, of course. So you need somebody to dig, but you also need somebody to say, what does it mean? You know? And so I've been on that theory side, not at all on the dig side. But for the last 6 years, I've been teaching a evolution of brain course, the evolution of brains, at IIT Gandhinagar. And so I spend the month of December and January before we start school here in Gandhinagar. And so what I did for them is I requested some skulls. So they got the skull of Ardipithecus and Lucy and Neanderthal skull, and I think we're up to about 9 skulls, so that they have an archaeology program there, and at least they have the skulls that created these hand axes, like from Shantipapu, like 500,000 years ago, 1 million years ago. They have all these hand axes in a large collection, and so I kind of show the students the theory behind all of those artifacts.
Okay. So many of our viewers who are currently listening or will like to see it later on the YouTube when we put it. In India, this discipline currently, I don't think many people do, although archaeology is studied in many universities and institutes, but cognitive aspects of archaeology, particularly using archaeological facts to reconstruct our cognitive, the evolution of the cognitive system is very new. So where the discipline is moving, because you have done probably the most foundational work, and where do you see it going in the next couple of years? Its scope expanding, connecting to some other disciplines, because you have certainly connected it to neuropsychology, as I see Professor Coolidge's work. He has published a book as well on cognitive neuropsychology and cognitive psychology, working memory models. Any further expansion to some other territories? Or
I'll answer first, and then I'll have Fred answer. The field is beginning to fragment a little bit. And one direction that's been very successful is the neuroarchaeology direction. So the work of Dietrich Stout, for example, and some of the people at University of Indiana. The downside of this, of course, is it's very expensive and convincing funding agencies to provide you the capital necessary to get that kind of research program going turns out to be very difficult. But I think that's one direction that's going to grow because it accomplishes two things. First, it does help us understand the evolution of human cognition. But also, the second, perhaps unanticipated consequence is it has an effect on cognitive science itself. One of the, I think, most underdeveloped aspects of cognitive science is an understanding of tool use and technology. It's something that cognitive science has not done a lot of work on. And so some of the work that the archaeologists are doing in neuroarchaeology are revealing some things about tool use in a cognitive sense that are very interesting from a both neurological perspective and a cognitive science perspective. So that's one direction that I think is going to be successful. Another, which Fred and I have been dabbling in for the last couple of years, is the use of 4E models of cognition. And the reason I think that's going to grow is because it takes a very different view of the mind, in which it cuts out what has been called the epistemic mediator. So if you cut out any reference to what's going on in the head, then you have more, in the sense of more direct access to cognitive issues by analyzing the tools. I have to admit, though, that I'm pretty much a Cartesian in terms of my view of the mind, and cutting the brain out and cutting cognition out seems to me to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But that's my personal view. It's a very popular perspective in Britain today, and I expect it to continue to be so. I would like to think that cognitive archaeology will grow. I'm not entirely sure that's the case. As you can tell, Fred and I are beginning to get a little bit long in the tooth. We're at an institution that, in my department, I have no graduate students whatsoever. So it's a little hard to keep a research program going in the absence of graduate students. But I'm optimistic. There are other schools where people are taking cognitive archaeology seriously, especially in Britain, Cambridge, Oxford, University of Southampton. All of these schools are taking the cognitive perspective very seriously. University of Indiana, Emory University in the United States, to a certain extent, University of Arizona. So it's been slow. I've been doing this for 40 years, and it's been a very slow development, but I think it's beginning to catch on. So, Fred, did you want to follow up on that at all?
Yeah, I finished my PhD 46 years ago, and I still felt wet behind the ears. So I said, I'm going to do a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical neuropsychology for 2 years. So that was 44 years ago when I finished my clinical neuropsych postdoc. I worked in a big teaching hospital and just for 2 years evaluated head injury, brain damage. And I was really interested in brain function and, of course, dysfunction, but how the brain related to specific behaviors. And that's what I did assessing in neuropsychology. But it's almost embarrassing. If I had my notes, which I don't, from 1976, how much we've learned about the brain since. So when you say, Professor Mishra, like how do you stay up with this stuff? It's unbelievable, especially, I've heard this thing, a joke. Imagine writing a book about current brain knowledge. Like it changes every week, every month, something comes out and you go, oh my goodness, And let me give you an example. I'm finishing the book. I've been working on it for 4 years, Evolutionary Neuropsych, that I mostly wrote at IIT Gandhinagar because I had a lot of time on my hands. And I send the final notes, and then I see an article on the hippocampus. Not only has place and grid cells, but it's got cells that recognize conspecifics, dedicated to recognize if someone's of the same species. And I even realized, if you walk babies in strollers and two people are walking by babies, the babies look at each other. I mean, these conspecific neurons in the hippocampus are not only attuned to conspecifics, but they're age related because they don't look at the mother, they look at the other kid. Dogs look at dogs. So I immediately took that part of my manuscript back, wrote in another paragraph, and then said, okay, I'm shutting off my computer. I'm not even looking at the newspaper. So that I wouldn't have to update the book.
And I think that we have to be a bit of dualists while tackling with these questions because the evolution of cognition, the software, and the evolution of the brain, I think it has not been very easy to set up any parallelism. So all these new brain imaging studies by asking graduate students to do some stone tools and then finding the brain areas. But my personal view would be that either we are talking about cognition in the classical sense as it is understood, the software, you can imagine an algorithm, or the brain. And dualism certainly enters into the picture if we're talking theoretically. So I think there are certainly other people who would like to take a brain-based view. The brain ended up evolving and then getting all these things together. But that could be another view. So,
well, certainly in my case, I've looked at cognitive models primarily, and I have, at least until recently, until I started working with Fred, tried to stay away from brain models, primarily because I didn't really know how to deal with them. And one of the things we know from the record of fossils and archaeology is that the two don't match up very well. That is, the evidence for brain evolution can't be mapped onto the evolution that we have from the stone tools. They're two different sequences. They don't seem to correlate very well, and we're not in a position yet to make any sense of that lack of correlation.
All right, I think there can be many other questions. This is certainly an interesting area, and there's no end to fascination people have about, say, the universe and prehistory. I think these are the two things that can keep you awake, and there is no end to questions. And I again think that we are today very happy, and we are fortunate to have two figures who really have set up milestones for other researchers. I'm not from the field, but I take an interest in language evolution because I do quite a bit of work in psycholinguistics. And you may know that there is a lot of debates in the evolution of language, particularly with regard to the dating. Chomsky and company 80,000 years ago, other people 60,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago. So I'm not getting to that even. But I think other people would link it up with their own disciplines. So one question, how do you see the current events? This is being held as a defining moment in human history, changing everything, when I'm referring to the virus's impact on cognition, other people are beginning to write about it. Do you kind of predict that this would leave an impact on the way? It's a question of adaptation and question of evolution as well. Of course, in a very long.
I'm going to pass that buck to Fred and let Fred start on that one.
Well, I was thinking that if evolution, is characterized by these periods of sudden change and then stasis, is it possible where we are in a period of stasis and that we won't see the dramatic changes that we've seen before? Like, for example, going from Lucy to Homo erectus, double brain size, beautiful stone tools where they were just crude, pounding hammers. And then these orignation, the culture of Homo heidelbergensis, who turned into modern Homo sapiens and comes into Europe 45,000 years ago. There was a dramatic change back then. And maybe we're in a period of stasis. So we do get our students who say, what's going to happen in the future to brains? Maybe not much. Maybe we're in a period of stasis. What do you think, Tom?
I kind of like the stasis argument. I'm just thinking about possible implications of the coronavirus. Just speaking as an evolutionary scientist, even though it's looking as if it's incredibly impactful to us in a biological sense, if you actually look at sort of natural selection impact at the moment, it's probably negligible. In the United States, if you look at the sort of mortality curves, most of the people being taken out in the United States are people like Fred and me, who are basically past our reproductive ages, past our productive ages, and it might work as a cleansing agent in that sense to get rid of all the old ideas. I suppose one could look at it from that point of view. If I look at it cynically from the perspective of American politics, it certainly has not brought out the intelligence of the American population in any degree at all. In fact, it's rather frightening what's happening in the United States in terms of people's willingness to attend to science. And that's a kind of frightening thought in a general sense, that if people are so willing to abandon science, what does that mean for us in the future?
All right, I think over to Vaishnavi now. If there are any questions from the audience, then they can be taken up.
So before we get into the audience questions, I have a question of my own. So you mentioned that in one of your papers that working memory was initially developed in Homo sapiens, and later on executive functions and cultural cognition came into place. So is it possible that this implies that working memory is a fundamental cognitive function which might be responsible in enabling or causing the development of other functions like executive control and attention, etc.? Is something special about working memory which was inherently necessary for Homo sapiens and developing the modern cognition that we have today?
I think it's important to realize that from this multi-component idea of working memory, that it's ancient. It's absolutely ancient. I mean, the oldest in the animal kingdom, if you go back to real first animals, it's simple flatworms, 545 million years ago. Did they have working memory? Well, let's say. Did they make decisions? Yes. So they had rudimentary executive functions, right?
Yeah.
Did they have some way of negotiating space? Well, they had two little eye-like things that could react to light and dark, and the executive function directed the little flatworm this way or that way based on what they saw in their environment. Okay? Now, they had nothing like phonological storage, but if we go to primates, 65 million years ago, and we're in the lineage of primates, we are primates, 65 million years ago, were these little nocturnal creatures making decisions? Absolutely. You guess what they relied on? Not only visual spatial, because they're locomoting through trees, right? Sounds. Their phonological storage, they were attuned because they were so little and competing with all these other animals for more nutritious food, like fruit. They coordinated their activities through phonological store. So there you see ancient working memory. Did they memorize those sounds? Absolutely. They didn't create them anew, warning cries. So you get the history of working memory, the ability to make the decisions, the ability to move around in your environment appropriately, to hear sounds. And we're doing this whole thing through sounds, right? We don't really need our pictures, but to understand this whole lecture, we really needed phonological storage and declarative long-term memory. Those primates had it 65 million years ago. So when we say enhanced working memory, okay, we had then all these primates, all these animals had aspects of working memory. Fair enough, Vaishnavi? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have another question, if I can be quick with that.
Please.
So you also mentioned that there was a phase when cultural cognition got enhanced significantly in Homo sapiens. Is it possible that the genetic mutations which caused or might have caused that enhancement in cultural cognition, can we trace back the environmental changes that might have triggered those mutations? Is it possible for us to map the time period or the significant events that might have taken place in the environment indirectly by mapping the genetic mutations which might have been responsible?
Well, it is interesting that geneticists tell us this genetic event happened a confidence interval, like I said, of 100,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago, with an average about 35,000 years ago. Geneticists tell us that. And we do know it had to do probably with the coding of neurons, some aspect of that. Now, we think it's earlier, in that confidence interval. I mean, back to closer to 100,000 years ago, around the time of that Toba explosion, right? So what happens around 50,000 years ago? A clear explosion of culture. We get the first cave paintings. We get now personal ornaments. We get highly ritualized burials. We get figurines like that Hohenstein Stadel. Amazing stuff. We get Venuses. It's interesting that we get that explosion of culture paralleled with what geneticists tell us happened, this gene sweep. And by the way, that gene was in the microcephalin family. You've heard of microcephaly, children born with really small brains? It's in that family. That gene regulates brain growth. So we do know that gene that came online or genetic mutation that came about 35,000, 50,000, 100,000 years ago, had something to do with brain growth, which is kind of fascinating. And then we get this dramatic change in culture. So I don't think those are accidental pairings.
And to follow up on Fred's answer, I think given the developments in human genetics, and especially comparative genetics and reconstructing archaic genomes, that down the road we're going to have a much more precise idea of when that happened. And we might even be able to place it geographically a little bit better. Currently, there's debate in paleoanthropology about whether this original population of 2 to 10,000 people lived in East Africa or South Africa. Given the studies of archaic DNA now, we are able to specify geographic areas much more precisely. And I'm guessing that within the next decade, we'll have a much, much better idea of when that happened and what the specific adaptational circumstances were. I mean, was it a response to environmental changes that were the result of the Toba explosion? Maybe, that's a pretty good chance. But it might have been some other factor as well. And so I anticipate that, yes, we will have a better answer to that question in just a few years.
It's part of why I love this whole cognitive archaeology is, for me, more dramatic things and more interesting things happen in archaeology, and in anthropology than in psychology, which my PhD is in psychology. So now we know, geneticists tell us, hey, guess what? Heidelbergensis might have given rise or had a cousin, the Denisovans in Siberia. And now we know from geneticists, there's DNA from some other unknown Homo species. So, it's just simple to say Homo heidelbergensis gave rise to us and Neanderthals. And now we know maybe there were the Denisovans, what's their relationship, and an unknown, they found the genes for this new species, but they haven't found the bones yet. So those things are just quite exciting. And, it's sort of adapt or survive. So when Tom and I hear about, oh, look at this new finding, we have to say, wait, how does that fit into what we've already said? Do we have to modify our theory? How can we accommodate it? Accommodate, that was a Piaget term, Tom.
That's good, thanks.
Assimilate, accommodate.
Assimilate and accommodate, yes.
So we'll take some audience questions now. And the first one is from Seema Prasad. She says, when you look at ancient tools and infer the cognitive functions required for making them, are we generalizing that these functions were present in the entire population at that time? Are we taking into account that there might be individual differences in cognitive functions among our ancestors?
I'll take that, Fred. So the answer is no. We have almost no access to the range of variability. And this is a problem. We tend to assume that the artifacts we find are typical for the population. So, for example, I showed you early on a very beautiful hand axe from the site of Katupan in South Africa. It's a gorgeous artifact. There are thousands of hand axes from Katupan. The rest of them are all really ugly. So how do we interpret that? Is this hand axe made by one exceptional individual who then fell out of the population and is irrelevant? Or was that individual somehow typical and the other people were just not bothering making nice hand axes? And we don't know really how to resolve that issue. And we tend to assume that the artifacts we find are typical for the time period. I don't know what else we can do, and unless we have a very large sample. Now, the Box Grove site, we have hundreds of hand axes, all beautifully made. I think for that site, it's a reasonable conclusion that all of the people had those abilities. For Katupan, maybe not. So that's not much of an answer, but that's about as good as we can do.
So another question is by Akshay Dikshit. He says, cognition is metabolically expensive. How do you think social cognition shaped the formation of modern human relationship? With modern human relationship, I am referring to maintaining a lifelong mate.
You want to take that, Fred?
Can you start?
Oh, well, can I start? Sure. One of the things we do know from studying non-human primates, primarily, is that social cognition is a very, very important aspect to all primate lives. And we are very good at social cognition. For example, we are very good at what evolutionary psychologists call cheater detection. We're very good at figuring out who's cheating us. Why we elected Donald Trump, I have no idea, but most of the time we're very good at identifying people who are cheating us. And so yes, the answer to that is social cognition has been very important. How it ties into mating systems is a very interesting question. Fred and I have talked among ourselves about, for example, Neanderthals. Did Neanderthals have marriage? That's an interesting question. Turns out that marriage is really a legal concept. It has to do with property and it has to do with children. And So a modern kind of marriage is really probably something that only emerged in the relatively recent past. But did they have pair bonding? That is, did adult male and adult female Neanderthals attract one another and establish relatively permanent bonds over the course of years or decades? And I think there's a very good chance that that's the case. And I think establishing a pair bond is an important part of human social behavior, and it probably goes very far back in human evolution, maybe all the way back to Homo erectus. So I set Fred up so Fred can now finish with a more profound answer.
No, thanks for starting. I was thinking that I learned from you, Tom, that we use like this comparative method in cognitive archaeology, and we could compare all kinds of primates now for guessing what our earlier behaviors were. But there's great danger in it. That's what I've learned from you, Tom, is like just take chimpanzees and bonobos, probably same species, very close genetically. Bonobos solve everything by making love to each other. Chimpanzees solve everything by eating the competition or the competition's babies. So if you say, we've been more chimp-like than bonobo-like, well, we can't use that comparative method. We can't rely on it so much. So, and in modern studies of social cognition, of course, are provocative and interesting, but I don't know how much we can say about our early history.
So the next question is by Amar Pratap Singh. He says, by bringing insights obtained from cognitive archaeology, can we hope to simulate implementation to improve AI models in speech therapy?
That's a hard question. I think one of the things we can do in cognitive archaeology is identify cognitive systems that are particularly well developed for modern humans. Let me give you an example. One of the things we're very good at is known as expert cognition. The work of Anders Ericsson and Gobet and some other people identify how people think when they do very complex activities like chess or a medical diagnosis. And we happen to be very good at that. Speech is something we're very good at. So that tells us that a lot of what we do is based on really long-term memory structures that we use very effectively. Now, in theory, could this help us understand AI or AI systems for speech therapy? In theory, yes. I don't know of anyone who has actually tried to do that, however. So Fred, did you want to follow up on that?
I just have, a personal bias. I think the Indian educational system, especially in the IITs, are doing things right, because I always see that I feel like the hardware, the ability to create this artificial intelligence, the actual hardware that does that, is always ahead of the modern minds. And so what I like about the IIT system is, 20% of their credits have to be outside technology. And so that's why I think the hardware people need people to think, well, what could we do with this? And I really feel my personal bias is we lag behind. What we can design technologically is the applications of those things. And that's why I think that integration, even in America, we make our engineers take 25% of their credit hours outside engineering, because we want them to take art, we want them to take dance, we want them to take sociology, psychology, so that ultimately whatever they invent, which I think is always ahead of how much we can understand or do with it. So I'm wondering where AI is going to go, given we need input from all the humanists, sociologists, psychologists, to really make advances.
So another question is from Sakshi Saxena. She asks if cognitive archaeology can be used to get insights on the development of human brain.
Do you want to take that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's what the whole lecture has been, is those insights, and when we've had these neurological changes, like larger olfactory bulbs, and it's kind of interesting. Brains don't fossilize, right? All we have is a skull. So how would we know that the olfactory bulbs were bigger in Homo sapiens than in Neanderthals? Well, it's interesting. Those olfactory epithelium that run our nose discrimination right into our brain go through a little plate called the cribriform plate, and it's perforated. And those perforations are greater in Homo sapiens skulls than in Neanderthal skulls. And that's why we suspect our olfactory bulbs were bigger. So now the question becomes, well, what does better smell discrimination mean? Does it mean that Neanderthals weren't offended by the same smells? There's probably more evidence for cannibalism among Neanderthals from 120,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago than there's evidence for cannibalism in Homo sapiens. So could they burn human flesh and not be offended by the smell as much as Homo sapiens? Was there something in their social cognition? Well, was there a prescription, let's say in Homo sapiens culture, that says, oh, we don't eat people? Whereas the Neanderthals said, yeah, but Neanderthals taste good, like a gustatory practice. I mean, they went extinct for some reason. And we only have two sides in that. One is it was accidental. But of course, as a evolutionary neuropsychologist, I don't believe it. I believe that there were brain changes. We know there's brain changes, differences in brain shape, and I think that had cognitive consequences that allowed us to survive and them to go extinct.
So another question is by Sushma. She asks, is there any evidence of spirituality among Neanderthals and how it influenced their cognition?
The answer to that is there is a little bit of evidence for spirituality among Neanderthals, but it's limited primarily to burials, to intentional burials. We know that Neanderthals did occasionally bury their dead. They didn't do a very good job of it. The few graves that we have are pretty shallow. Doesn't appear to have been a universal practice, but we can ask, why then did Neanderthals bury their dead? And one interpretation is a spiritual one, that they believed in some kind of a future existence and that their relatives needed to be protected in order to do that. We can also take the extreme skeptical position, and Fred and I tend to be conservative and skeptical, that there might have been other reasons. It could be that Neanderthals were burying their dead simply because it was emotionally painful for them to have the corpses of their relatives nearby. And they didn't want to carry them out to be eaten by cave lions, so instead they buried them to protect them. But it's still possible that it's an indication of Neanderthal spiritual life. That's about the best we have. We do not have any Neanderthal images, that is, images made by Neanderthals of imaginary creatures. We don't have anything like that. So yes, we have some indication, but if they did, it was not a well-developed kind of spiritual religious system that we have in the modern world today.
I would encourage your students to think about Occam's razor. Is the simpler explanation may be more attractive and more likely to be sound than the more complicated. So one of the recent spiritual claims for Neanderthals was in a cave in France called Bruniquel. It dates to about 176,000 years ago. And they found all these stalagmites in a circle in the cave. So I just saw a recent article that said, unquestionably evidence for symbolic thinking and ritual and religion. Unquestionably. But let's do Occam's razor. Well, the first thing actually is I encourage your students to go to the original. If you can look at the original paper for Brunichel, the authors say at the end, in conclusion, this may be a step, just a step towards modern symbolic thinking, or it may be something completely prosaic and domestic. Like, I don't know what that would be, but, you know, they made a circle for some domestic reason, you know, or some common reason. And it had nothing to do with symbolism or ritual. So what you'll see is people that want to read into it, you know, and say, oh God, this is the foundational religion in Neanderthals 176,000 years ago. But Occam's razor, let's take the simpler explanation, is probably a safer one. So Neanderthals buried their people. Maybe a dead person attracts predators. They knew enough to cover them so that they wouldn't attract predators.
So another question is by Yash. He says, have you ever come across a series of art, I mean of the same type, over the years that depicts the same thing but has evolved in its expressiveness?
I'll take that, Fred. The answer is, for anything prior to 10,000 years ago, no. That is, we can't actually see the internal development of artistic styles. A good example is Chauvet Cave. We showed some slides from Chauvet Cave. There are apparently two different episodes of cave painting. It's impossible to tell a difference between them, and they're separated by about 6,000 years. So one of the puzzles about at least cave painting is that it appears fully blown from the very beginning. That is, we can't see any gradual development in technique or in style. The first cave paintings are as impressive as the last cave paintings. And between them, and there's about in Europe at least today, there's about a 25,000 year period of cave paintings. There's very little change technically in what these folks are doing. So that's a very good question, because it suggests there's something extremely conservative about the art in the Stone Age. Do we understand this? No, we don't have a good explanation for it.
It excited me to jump in and are there any evidences of training, like younger children or other younger people? Because there is always this tendency, if you know something, you would teach somebody else. And we tackled the question of maybe one painter or sculptor was very famous and he took a larger space in the cave. What about the others? Is there any evidence of this training activity? Because
there's some evidence of perhaps younger individuals doing some, but in cave painting, there's very little. It's as if the cave painting was being done by adults, perhaps for being viewed by children, but they didn't let children mess around too much. In stone tools, we do find clunky stone tools. And so we find stone tools in which it appears that juveniles are practicing. But in the art, we don't have good examples of that, no. At least with the cave painting, which is what I know. There might be examples somewhere.
The limitation of the space must have led to the situation that since it is limited and it should be used by proficient artists, or because in the modern world you can paint, erase, and so that probably has played a role in expansion of, we don't bother about wasting paper or computer resource when we teach. But in that circumstance, it's imaginable that it's limited.
I think that, and also the locations of them, as Fred mentioned, many of them are located deep underground, often over a kilometer. So it takes a considerable amount of effort to get there. You have to have the technology to do that. And we generally think it was a pretty serious undertaking. And if it was a serious undertaking, maybe we don't get the children involved. Again, I'm guessing on that point.
Okay. You are becoming a cognitive archaeologist. You're starting to develop that curiosity, Ramesh, because
No,
there's no practice. We don't see.
I have been interested for a while now, and I would like to actually invest some time if the world opens up, maybe to visit and spend really some time learning and connecting with the ideas that I work with. And it's a fascinating area to speculate and get to the tools, and maybe, who knows, because these are potential ideas to consider. What might have happened? Why people, why it was all done by proficient adults? Because most pictures that we see on the internet are fabulous. Because there are no half-completed pictures. There are no pictures that are like somebody else, like we do improvisations. Painters discard paintings that they don't like. Those kind of stuff.
And if you look at the literature on children's drawing, there are certain kinds of figures that children make all over the world. And we don't find these in Paleolithic art. We don't find stick figures. We don't find the tadpole figures. We don't find the kinds of things that modern human children start making when they start to draw. They just don't appear in the art. So it tells us something, I think.
Yeah, so Ramesh, was there a guild where you had to have certain abilities, and if you weren't in the guild, you didn't get to paint in the cave? And that's why we see no practice.
I can imagine, because it's just like, you have a little cricket pitch somewhere in your home, in India, and you don't allow others to play who do not know how to handle balls and bats. So I think it's likely that mentality. But the key question would be when that kind of a very serious conservative mentality with regard to how we handle space and who becomes famous developed. And so it becomes again a question of social cognition, but movie hierarchies among the painters and other people, the audiences, the art critics. Whether there may have been critics as well who would have been telling them that you are better than him. And
already your guild is getting elaborated. You've got the critics.
Go ahead, and it's becoming. We already have had about 1.5 hours of discussion. So, Vaishnavi, any other questions?
There's one final question, and by Shivam Bora, he asks, how can we tell if a cave painting or a tool is made by a Homo sapien or a Neanderthal?
I'll take that. Often we can't. Unless there's artifacts clearly associated with the paintings that we can associate then with the people who made them, we can't make that distinction. For Neanderthals, so far there has been not a single example of an indisputable bit of cave art. There are a few markings from a cave in Spain that some people think might have been made by Neanderthals, but they date to about 45,000 years ago, and that's about the time modern humans arrived on the scene. And so it makes it a hard argument to make. But just based on what we know about Neanderthals, if you have an image of say, an abstract creature like the Hohenstein-Stadel, that's almost certainly made by a modern human, not by a Neanderthal. We don't have any evidence of Neanderthals being able to conceive of that kind of an entity. And if we eventually find evidence for that, Fred and I will be wrong, and we will have to retire immediately.
And let us remember at the end that Tom and I love Neanderthals. We make a living off Neanderthals. We make a little bit of money off Neanderthals with that book. But we love them. We love them. And so we're just trying to explain why they went extinct and why we are here now, listening to one another. And that's all we're trying to do. And so we call them the other human type. They're probably because we could interbreed. They're the same species, but they went extinct for a reason. We kind of feel that those brain-shaped differences had cognitive consequences, and the cognitive consequences were positive for us and sadly negative for them. Well, thanks again for inviting us so much.
Thank you very much.
I hope you're at University of Hyderabad?
Oh yeah, at the moment, yes. And
okay,
we are kind of, as is everywhere, we are closed, and this is the way to get going certain things. So we are having this series, and we will continue. And And thank you very much for taking time. And I hope that everything is fine as time in these uncertain times. So thank you, Vaishnavi, for organizing it. And I thank Seema, who initially contacted Professor Coolidge and Professor Wynn, actually. And then it all started from there. And so all the students have been very helpful in, even in online platforms, you need a lot of people to assist. It's not clicking buttons. So it is a lot of hard work to get it done smoothly. And we are doing it from the Center for Neurocognitive Science, which is part of School of Medical Sciences, University of Hyderabad. And so thank you very much from us.
Thank you.
Dhanyavad.
Thank you.
Namaskar.